Scallop dredging then consists of fishing two sets of gear either side of the boat. They're dropped down the side of the boat but on derricks, which are the large poles that you see on these fishing boats. They're lowered to the seabed, they fish hard on the bottom, and as you can see from this diagram here, two long wires that eventually go down into a long bar either side. On each end of this bar there'd be a set of hard rubber wheels. Now they're not tyres or anything like that, although they can be depending on what ground they're fishing on, but normally they're solid rubber on these wheels. That's what helps pull the bars along the bottom. Now they weigh an absolute ton, these bars. They do really weigh an awful lot. But the way this method works is it's designed to dig into the seabed and quite literally dig and flick these scallops out from the bottom of the seabed. Now on the dredges themselves, which are like the little bag things hanging off the main bar, on the front of them they've got a set of what they call tooth bars. Now these can vary in size and styles depending on what ground they're fishing, and they can change these to catch more or less scallops depending on what they're doing. And then on either side of these are actually attached to springs as well. Think of like a car suspension spring, very similar to this, and there's one either side of the dredge, and these can be wound down to tighten the springs up or loosened off to make them more flexible. And again, depending on what ground they're doing will depend how tight these springs are wound down. What these fishermen will do is they go along, they have a haul, they get the bags up to the side of the boat, and they'll look at what bag has got the most scallops in it, and they will push down on these springs, these tooth bars, and they try and gauge the tension between the ones that have or haven't got more or less in. And then what they will do is they will tighten or loosen up these springs to make the tooth bars tighter or looser to try and bring the catch up per haul. It's quite a delicate art actually, and some fishermen are better at it than the others, but the good ones, they can really fine tune these tooth bar springs and get maximise the scallop catch for each haul. Now the bags themselves and the scallop bags themselves, because of the type of fishing it is, and it is very, very hard on the gear, the bags themselves are actually made out of like a big chainmail, and the destruction that it does to these bags, wear and tear over the course of a week or 2 weeks fishing is horrendous. You've got solid galvanised steel bars that by the end of a fishing trip can be worn down and being needed to be replaced. It really is hard on the gear and also hard on the bottom, which I'll come on to now. So like I said previously, the way this method works, they literally dig these scallops out of the ground, be it hard ground, soft ground, or around wrecks. What a lot of fishermen like to do with this type of method is get right up close to a wreck that's got their little safe haven, scrape around it, dig these scallops out, and be careful not to hit the wreck itself. I've been on a scallop boat once or twice before that has actually clipped a wreck, and it can be quite dangerous, and you end up hauling up bits of metal, and it has been known to roll boats occasionally, but they do literally have to dig and scrape these shellfish out, and as a result, the damage to the seabed with this particular method can be quite substantial. And there's been documented evidence of it as well. They've gone down there and they've seen these scallop beds, and they've been absolutely decimated. The ground is literally like a ploughed farmer's field where these boats have gone. Yes, the sea does recover over it, in soft ground. Yes, it will flow over again in the next tide. It will get covered up. But the damage to kelp and seabed, that sort of stuff, bream nests and all that sort of thing, this is a very damaging method. But unfortunately, they haven't really developed a way yet of changing this method so it's less damaging to the bottom. They have tried different various dredges, but for some reason it just hasn't seemed to have caught on yet. But yet, scalloping, it is a very good method to catching scallops, but it also does a hell of a lot of damage, and you do get a bit of fish bycatching here, and depending on the length of tow, that fish is often completely battered up and goes in the market as seconds. But that's scallop fishing. That's how it's done. Any questions on this method, just drop it in the comments below. So moving on to lobster pots then. Down here on the south coast and around most of the country, they're catching lobster. Down west, they do also catch crawfish. And this method is done by shooting one single line of rope, marked either end by a Dan, as I call them. Other people call them enders or marker buoys, whatever you want. But basically a marker at each end. You normally, not pictured here, have an anchor as well on either end to stop the lines from moving, depending what part of the country you're in. And then off of that main rope, you have what is called legs. On the end of each leg is attached a lobster pot. Now, you get different types of pots. You get parlour pots, and you get inkwell pots. And the way the lobsters go in can vary. Sometimes it's through the side, other times it's through the top. So the ground these guys are looking for is reefy, rocky ground. That's where the lobsters live. Ideally, you want a nice bit of sandy ground that then butts up to a bit of reef. You get a lot of lobsters down the edge of those two bits of ground. And what they will do is they shoot the lobster pots over. They will leave them to soak, which is basically just soaking, just means how long they're down the bottom for. Now, these are baited up. In most types of pots, you have a bait bag, or depending if it's a top entry pot where the lobster comes in from the top, they have a bit of rubber band around the neck of the pot, and they stuff things like mackerel, lobster, gurnard. Everyone's got their favourite baits. Everyone will say they catch more than others. But whatever bait you're putting in there, the idea is that the scent gets in the lobsters. They crawl up to the pot, down and in, and once they're in, they simply can't get back out again. And that's how the pot works. It's a really low impact method. It doesn't do any damage, you know, other than a bit of silt disturbance, the occasional bit of ghost fishing gear. If they get caught out in a storm and the pots are lost, and they will tend to roll around. The downside is they will keep fishing if they're down there with a bit of bait in, and other fish will get in there and make a home out of them. But there's no towing around. Once they're on the bottom, they're sat there, and that's it. They are working, and it's a really, really effective method. And the guys on the boats, they get into a right routine with this. As they're coming over, someone's opening the door to get the lobsters or crawfish out, goes to the next person, they bait it up, they stack it, and it goes back again. It becomes a really well-oiled machine here. Lobster prices, though, have been a bit up and down this country. A lot of people complaining about the prices of the lobsters. They get paid per kilo, not per lobster. And the trouble is, when you get a few in the market, or if there's just not enough demand, the cost of the market is buying them for goes down, so the fishermen get paid less. It is a very labour-intensive way of fishing, but it's a good fun way, and you can have some great catches of lobsters using this method. And you also do get a bycatch of brown crab. You get the odd fish in there as well, conger eel, ballan wrasse, and other species. But genuinely, what you're going after is what you're catching here with these. Coming on to stern trawling, not to be confused with beam trawling, which we'll come on to next. Stern trawling consists of towing normally one net behind the boat. Again, 2 lengths of wires are let out. They can be let out on derricks like we covered with scalloping, or they can be just let out from the back of the boat and towed directly from the boat. All depends how much spread they want. So by having it on the derricks, the front of the net opens up more. You can catch more fish that way. Those 2 wires then go down to 2 doors, also known as otter boards. And on the bottom of these big metal doors, sometimes made of wood, depending on the size of the boat, they have things called shoes. These essentially stand bolt upright, and they skid and skate along the bottom. And the way they're angled and the way they're designed is they're aerodynamic. They literally force the net open. The wires spread apart, as you can see from this diagram, and that's what pulls the trawl open. Going down to the trawl itself then, you have floats on the top of the net, and on the bottom, as you can see here on this diagram, you have a thing called a foot rope. The foot rope is made out of rubber discs. That's what skirts along the bottom. The floats pop up and they keep the net open. And the fish, as they get caught in between these 2 nets, they bump up over the foot rope and roll down into the net. You have what they call the wings, followed by the tunnel, and then you have finally the cod end. And that's what comes aboard, and the rope's open at the bottom of the net, and that's how the fish is brought on board. Now, stern trawling, you can target different types of fish with this, although it's not particularly Pacific. You can catch more flatfish by modifying your trawl and making it lower to the ground and changing the foot rope. You can also catch more cuttlefish, depending on how you do things. Basically, you can catch more of one fish, but ultimately, most fish that go in this end up in the back of the net, and then they have to get let go on deck. And if they're not wanted, they are thrown back over the boat and are known as what is called discards. Now, a lot of people think this is really damaging, and it does do a degree of damage to the bottom. Certainly, if you're going to run through a kelp bed with it, if a trawler goes inshore, starts going through all the kelp beds, yes, it's going to damage the kelp, and that has happened here, especially on the Sussex coast. However, they're not as damaging as a beam trawler or a scalloper. You actually, by the time this net is let back from the boat, and it can be a good way back from the boat, the buoyancy in the water and the fact that the doors are open and the net is skimming along the bottom, it actually doesn't dig right into the ground. And on the next storm or a couple of tides later, the silt damage has actually been washed back over again. Yes, the fish have been caught by the trawl, but it's not ripping up the bottom. It's not churning up the bottom like other methods do. So while yes, this can be frustrating, it's not ripping the bottom apart like other methods. Now, the best way I've described that theory, I had described to me in the past, and I'll try to describe it to you, is the rubber foot rope here on these trawls. Normally, you change them once a year, maybe a bit more or a bit less, depending on the ground you're fishing. But they're thick, solid rubber discs. You know, it's old rubber tires have been melted down. It's a solid disc of metal, disc of rubber. And now, if you used to take that on land and drive it and tow it around the car park, by the end of the day, those rubber discs are going to be completely flat. The concrete's going to have worn them down. On a boat, however, when you're letting it back down, and there's some sort of physics in here, I don't understand it completely, I'm not that clever. However, when you're letting it back from the boat, the buoyancy of the water, the fact you've got so much line out, those rubber discs, it'll take you a whole year to wear them down. So it goes to show how little they're scraping along the bottom. You know, and we do hit some rocky ground out there on the trawlers. You know, when you're targeting place and stuff, you have a different sort of foot rope on. You're bouncing over really rocky ground. And of course, you've got the friction and the heat generated by that, even though it's underwater. It takes a whole year for one of these foot ropes to wear down. So, you know, it's not doing the damage that you think it may be doing when you see it. Yes, it does catch fish. Yes, it will totally wipe out seaweed and kelp, etc. Get that totally. However, this isn't as damaging as some other methods that I think people aren't quite aware of. So moving on to beam trawlers now, not to be confused with stern trawling that we've just covered. The boats do look identical and similar, and most boats can get out for stern trawling or beam trawling. However, a beam trawler, as you can see here, fishes a pair of nets off the derricks, which we covered in the previous slide. They run off of what looks like a scallop bar, very similar. However, on the ends, you haven't got wheels. You have what I would call skates. Now, this goes down to a net that's very similar to a stern trawl, in it has a set of wings, tunnel, and a cod end, and it has a foot rope. The big difference is it has a massive chain mat, which is essentially a load of chain links linked together to form a mat. This is what agitates the bottom, stirs up the flatfish, which they're after. These beam trawlers, they're targeting Dover sole, plaice, turbot, brill. Certain times of the year, they will also target cuttlefish and monkfish. The big money fish is what they're after. They prefer the softer bottoms, less damage on the gear, and that's where the target species is. However, they will get right in amongst that rocky ground as well at times. Beam trawlers, depending on the size and power of the vessel, they have to be a certain distance off the land, but the smaller ones, they can come right in, and you can have a bit of ground that for an angler has been really productive for plaice, sole, etc., even turbot, depending where you are. A beam trawler will come in, and it will start going round and round. It will do slightly less longer tows as a stern trawl. Stern trawl normally looking at 3-4 hours. Beam trawlers could be a lot less than that. And they keep hauling up, and they fish a bit of ground out until the catch gets so low that it's not worth fishing on, and then move off. It then, of course, takes a bit of a long time or a while for fish to come back into that area, repopulate it, in which time the beam trawlers have moved off, the anglers come in, and you can notice a severe drop-off in your catches. However, one little top tip, if I can give it here from this commercial video, is certain fish species like cod, they understand what this is doing, and when they're going over a bit of ground, those little bits of fish that are popping out the nets, the small ones, the bits that get damaged, smashing up the scallops, the shellfish, the prawns, cod can sit behind these boats, and they will actively follow the boats behind. And I've done it before, where we've been lure fishing behind a big Belgian beam trawler out on a bit of ground, and we're picking up cod and pollock directly behind these beam trawlers. So while there can be a pain for certain types of fishing, if you're in an area and it happens, try using it to your advantage if you can, and try for something else, because these fish, they're not stupid. If they're seeing this go along and all these little bait fish are popping out the little holes, or there's suddenly a load of smashed up scallops on the ground, putting scent in there or whatever, you're going to catch fish there. So have a go. Don't be despondent if it does happen. If you're in an area where this is happening, just switch your methods up and see if you can pick some fish up, because I tell you now, I've done it and it works. Long lining now then. Not done particularly much here on the south coast. Down West Country, I think they do a little bit of it. And over in Guernsey, I have messed about with it privately, and I will be doing a little bit on my own channel shortly on long lining, just for a bit of fun. Works very similar principle to potting, only it's not pots, it's hooks and bait. 2 end markers, Dans, enders, pot buffs, whatever you want to call them, going down to 2 anchors to keep it in place, 1 long length of main line, and then instead of legs, you have snoods. So snoods being mono or braid, depending on how you've rigged the line up. And then obviously instead of pots, it's hooks and bait. Depending what fish you're targeting will depend on what hooks and baits you put on and how long they're soaking for. Remember, soaking is how long basically it's left down on the bottom for. It can be long, it can be overnight. However, sometimes it can be as little as shooting one end away, a nice long length of line, and then jogging back up to where you started and hauling it again. Fishing's a bit different, you know. You've got a hell of a lot of hooks down there. You can find fish quite quickly. It can be done on sand or rock. Just one to bear in mind is if it's on rocky reef, you've got a good chance of it snagging up. So you might have to think about how you rig it up. But it can be really, really effective, and you can get a multitude of species on these long lines. It's done a lot by the Spanish. They do get a lot of discards on these, especially out in the Mediterranean. They get a lot of things like turtles and dolphins. Down here at the West Country, I know from seeing other people's videos, a lot of blue sharks often come up with long line hooks in them where they've been cut off at the long line boat. So is what it is. It's done for tuna as well. You can have a long line set on the bottom or you can have it up in the water. All depends what you're targeting, but highly sustainable. Other than a bit of damage to bycatch, you know, your dolphins and the rest of it, there's no damage to the sea bottom whatsoever, and it can be quite targeted fishery. So let's come on to set netting. Now there is various types of methods of set netting. There is a multitude of different types of nets. I'm going to try and broad brush all these together. Otherwise this video will be about 5 hours long because you get so many different types of net materials, different mesh sizes, etc, etc. So I'm going to try and condense this down to give you a basic understanding of how set netting works. So again, as with anything on the bottom, 2 enders, 2 dam buoys, pot markers, buff markers, whatever you want to call them, going down to an anchor, and then this goes over to a bridle or splits, which is the bit of rope that links the top of net with the bottom. On the top of the net, you have a floaty bit of rope or a bit of rope with floats on it, as pictured here. And the bottom is weighted with a bit of thing called a lead line. It's basically a weighted bit of rope that has lead all the way strung through it. So floaty top, heavy bottom. That's what makes the net stand up and stand proud, like you can see in the photo. This photo is quite dramatised. A common misconception about nets, and especially amongst anglers, shore anglers, is they think a net stands completely top to bottom, so surface to bottom. And for the most part of the case, that's actually not true. Most nets, because of the way they're rigged up and they're tied, the buoyancy is so minimal and so fine that when the tide is running, these nets are actually almost laying pretty flat. They're not even standing up at all. And a lot of the set nets that you see around the coast, certainly here on the Sussex coast, is targeting flatfish. So flatfish, they're hard on the bottom. There is no requirement to have the net, you know, 10, 15, 20 foot up in the air. And anyone who's watched my recent commercial fishing video on Dover Sole, you can see, and I'll put a video, it's wrong, I'll put a photo of a net here now, just so you can see the depth. The actual net itself stretched out is about 3 foot, but for the most part of the tide, it's actually only fishing about 10, 12 inches high, targeting those Dover Sole. And when that net's coming over in the video that I just did, you actually can see there's long periods where there is nothing in the net because it's so highly targeted. You know, there's no damage to the bottom here. It's a little bit of weight on a bit of silty bottom or a bit of rock. It's not doing any damage. The next set of tides, any minimal damage that has been done is covered up again. That's it. It's not towing the bottom. It's not wiping out kelp. It's not catching anything else, you know. You get the occasional seal, you get the occasional dolphin, you get the occasional other little bit of bycatch in there, but it is absolutely minimal and it's just part and parcel of the job. Now, the different types of nets that you can get can include a gill net, which is generally a fine mono type net. It's rigged up, so when they make these nets, you can change how much slack is in the net, i.e. how taut or how slack it is between floats. Now this can greatly vary your catch. But a gill net tend to be rigged with a bit of slack in it, made from mono. This is designed that when a fish gets in it, starts thrashing about, the more it thrashes, the more it gets tangled up and it gets hooked by the gills in its net. Really popular method for bass and that sort of thing, cod, pollock, all that sort of stuff. But but that's one way. Another type of net is a trammel net. Now, a trammel net will have a small inner wall, as they call it. So you have an inner net made with a small mesh, and on the outside, you will have a bigger, much larger diamond meshed wall. And what happens is the fish hit the smaller mesh, start swimming and struggling against it, and they actually pull themselves through the other larger outer mesh, and they essentially bag up, forming a big bag of net, and they just can't get out of it. That's trammel netting. And the other type you get is tangle netting. And again, very similar to gill nets, really slack, normally made out of mono, and it's just designed to literally, as soon as a fish touches it, it ends up getting caught up so much, it just can't get out. Now, depending what size mesh and what type of net you're using, whether it's a mono type net or a braid type net, will depend on what fish you catch. The bigger, the smaller the mesh, the heavier floats, the heavier the lead line, the depth you're fishing in it, where you set these nets, all has a great degree of influence on what you're catching. Depending on the time of year, a lot of people target Dover sole in these nets. They start tracking them out about 6 mile off, and as they move into shore, the netters just simply follow, and they can at times, as anglers would have seen, end up almost virtually on the shore. You know, rightly or wrongly, there's rules on it. The rules on set netting down here is 1.5 metres of tide above the headline, i.e. the float line, at all states of tide. However, that doesn't always happen. I know that nets get in closer sometimes. Rightly so, anglers get frustrated. But they're catching Dover sole, place cod, bass, pollock, whatever is out there. You know, they can target these nets to catch these fish. They're highly effective. You do get minimal discard in there. You do get a bit of whiting and small place, but other than that, it's pretty minimal, and the damage to the seabed is virtually nil. So moving on to probably the most sustainable method that we're going to cover today, as the description there says, rod, line and hooks. Back when the bass ban was trying to be brought in, or was brought in, and various factions were trying to petition to ban certain methods of commercial fishing, such as pair trawling for bass and drift netting for bass, they were trying to encourage people to go to rod and line. So a lot of fishermen, they did switch over, they've gone to rod and line, and now they're doing that rod and line fishing for bass. There's now people kicking off that there's too many rod and line anglers for bass. So they can't really win on that front. However, as the description says, they use rod and line using live baits and lures to catch bass. I think this year they've got 6.2 or 6.4 tonne for the year, which sounds a lot, but that is an entire year's worth of money they've got to catch there. Often they will fish single-handed, though I have seen bass boats with 2 or 3 people on them. Now that's 6.2 tonne. If you catch that for yourself, then obviously that's all for you. If you've got crew, with more crew comes more wages. So that then 6.2 gets split 3 ways, 2 ways, instead of 1 way. So what they do is all year they bounce around different wrecks, different ground marks. They catch bass, come in and land them. Bycatch wise, other than the live baits that they're using, so for your scad, your mackerels, your pouts, whitings, you do get the odd pollock and maybe the odd cod, and the occasional turbot is caught as well. But other than that, it's very, very highly targeted. 0 damage to the bottom, obviously, unless they lose a little bit of line and a weight. But compared to what we've seen, it's very minimal. And that's it. And that's how these guys make their living. Out there often in tiny little boats bobbing around. It's a really grafty way to catch a living and catch some fish here. So utmost respect for these guys. The other type of line fishing we have then is mackerel fishing. This is done with a gurdy normally. A gurdy is essentially a big reel bolted to the side of the boat. They can be automated depending on the setup and the costs that the boat's got. But what they do is they drop a long line of feathers down to the bottom and then just bring it back up again on the gurdy. As it comes through the gurdy wheel, they're automatically unhooked and the fish just roll into a box. Again, bycatch wise, as with anything with baits and feathers, you're generally going to catch the odd fish that you're not targeting, so a cod, a bass, a pollock. But again, really sustainable way of fishing, and when you drop on a mackerel shoal like this, you really can pull some big catches in. Another type of method, I don't think it's too common here in the UK, but another type of line fishing they do is pollock boarding. Now this is where they tow, it's called, as it says, a pollock board. It's almost like a mini sort of like the pool floats you'd get in a pool, and you have lines off the back of it, and they tow them at such a way and speed that they dive down, a bit like a diving lure does, or a Rapala lure with a lip on it. It dives down to a certain depth and it stays at that depth This does the same thing. They tow it over wrecks, over reefs, and that's the target pollock. A really effective fishery. The French actually do it quite a lot over the other side of the channel. But like I say, I don't think there's too many people over here doing it, but I'm happy to be told otherwise. But that's the three sort of main rod and line methods. Really sustainable, really ethical. And unless you lose a bit of gear, there's not too much that goes on in way of bycatch or seabed damage or anything like that. So probably the most sustainable form of fishing that we're going to cover here in this video. So drift netting now. So this was banned for bass. Drift netting was banned quite a while ago now, a few years ago. It was a deadly method. A bit of a story. I got into commercial fishing not long after I got injured, and the commercial boats were basically fishing unlimited amounts of drift net, and some boats were fishing a good couple of miles worth of drift net, and they were doing some serious bass catches in the winter. Bass in the winter, they shoal up, hit the surface, they move down the coast, and they migrate down to breed. Obviously, fishermen know this, and a method was developed. It was the bass nets just got better and better. Really fine mesh mono tangle nets, basically on floats, shot north to south. So basically, from one way across the tide, another, and they drift down the tide at night, and then a boat would sit on one end, as you can see here in this diagram at the end. A boat would just sit on one end, let it drift pretty much all night, sometimes half of one tide, so you go down one way and back the other, and then you'd haul the nets up, and it'll be often loaded, and I mean sometimes loaded with bass. Absolutely devastating. Then the rules came in, dropped it down to a mile worth of net, and then eventually they banned it altogether. It was absolutely deadly. Some huge bass catches. I mean, some boats were doing 30 grand a week in bass through the winter. You know, not a bad way to earn a living, that was it. But completely banned. In these nets, you'd also catch things like taupe. And I'm almost certain now, here on the south coast, we never used to see that many taupe. And now we've got an explosion of it. Because every night when I was doing it, we would catch at least 3 or 4 big 40, 50 pound female taupe, you know. And they hit the net, they spin up. And they're not worth anything. You can land them, but they're not worth a great deal. But, you know, you're taking those big females out of the equation. It's never a good thing. Get dolphins in these nets as well, even not here in the UK, Mediterranean, you know, it's a surface net. They're in there chasing the fish as well. But, like I said, completely banned now for bass. They do still use it for mackerel, though. It's very effective for mackerel, also very effective for herring. And it is just basically a floating net that drifts down the tide. For herring and mackerel, a really small mesh net is used. Still mono, because that's the best thing to catch these when using this method. But for bass now, it's completely banned. And even as a commercial fisherman, I understood how damaging this was. But obviously, it's a way of earning a living in a tough industry. But as a pleasure angler, I'm glad this has gone now. The commercial fishing, you know, they're sad to see it go, because in the winter, when times are tough, this was the go-to for 3-4 months. But as we're seeing now, the bass stocks have really, really come back from this. It has done a really good, effective job of bringing those stocks back to life. So in a couple of years' time, when those small fish now, which are everywhere, they're going to grow, and we're going to see the benefit of that. So pair trawling. Pair trawling, as the number suggests, 2 boats towing 1 trawl, and it's normally a mid-water trawl, this. And they're targeting things like bass and black bream. Now, this was a very, very popular method down here at my port in New Haven, and they used to go down at certain times of the year, pair trawling for black bream and bass, down to the west on the famous Kingmere Reef. And having been on a boat, I've done pair trawling, and I can tell you now, during bream season, it is absolutely devastating. We had some monstrous catches of black bream and bass, and I won't go into the numbers, but absolutely monstrous catches of black bream. It is now banned, and it's getting more banned in certain areas now. Even offshore, they're banning this method. Up north in Scotland, I believe they pair trawl quite a lot for prawns and other round fish up there. But down here, where we have bream nesting sites and bass spawning grounds, this was absolutely killer, and they're now banned it in a number of places, and it's a good thing. Again, the commercials won't like it because it's a very, very big earner at times, but what you found sometimes is you'd go through, you'd have your bream toes, you get a couple of 100 boxes of bream, put them in the market, go to do it the next day, get them again, and the price of the fish had gone down to almost nothing because the market had been flooded. So it's counterproductive, but very, very deadly method. It's like I've discussed previously, towing a trawl. Everything is exactly the same. It's just bigger on a more bigger scale. The weights you use, instead of doors, you have massive great pair weights just here either side, but it's all pretty much the same principle. Tow a net, have your wings and your panels down to a tunnel, into a cod end, get it up, unload it. But that was it. But you had to get a big haul because you had 2 crews to feed and pay wages for. So instead of having individual boats getting individual wages, it's all obviously whatever comes up in here goes between both boats. When the time comes to haul, what would happen is one boat would come to the other one, normally decided by the skipper or the lead skipper, and then you'd throw a line over, pass the cables over to the other boat, and one boat would haul the net up onto one deck. And then likewise, when you're shooting it away, it would get passed back over to the other boat. They'd steam apart and they'd go from there. When it comes to turning around, so when you're going to turn around with the net, it's a very highly coordinated thing. A lot of chat on the radio. Have to go at certain speeds, certain turns, and turn around in one go and go back up the other way. Because if it went wrong, it went wrong. But I'm glad this is banned now. Highly effective, bass and black bream, but not seen too much now here on the south coast. But it is still popular up north. So, whelk potting, done exactly the same way as lobster potting in terms of how it's rigged up. You have your end markers down to an anchor, and then your legs with pots coming off either end. Exactly the same. However, the difference this time round is with lobster pots, you shoot east to west normally. With whelk pots, you shoot across the tide, north to south. That's to get the scent flowing down. A whelk is basically a sea snail, and the pots here are made out of old plastic drums, little ones that hold oil, that sort of thing. And then the tops are cut off, bit of net in the top with a toggle to draw it tight, as you can see here. And then that's stuffed with old bits of bait like crab, fish, dogfish, all that sort of stuff. The snails, they climb up the side of the pots and then they go over the net. They can get over the net, but then they can't get back out of it and they fall into the little hole in the bottom. Then they're hauled up exactly the same way as lobster pots through the hauler. Someone will undo the toggle, give it a shake onto a whelk riddle, which basically grades out the size whelks. The smaller ones fall through the gaps into the bottom in a box and they're thrown back over the side to grow bigger. And then the bigger ones obviously don't fall through. They're scooped into little onion sacks. And then that's it. Then they're bagged up when the bag's full and then the process restarts again. Exported all over the world, whelks, but they're loved here in the UK as well on the little beach huts by the beaches, normally in a bit of vinegar, that sort of thing, eaten with a cocktail stick. But it's a highly, highly lucrative method here in the UK. It has been absolutely flogged to oblivion. So many boats now converting to it. You're allowed, I think it's 300 pots inside a 3 mile, another 300 pots to 6 mile, and then back at 6 mile, I believe it's unlimited. I think that's the numbers, don't quote me on it. But the whelkers, they have a lot of trouble further out with boats towing them away. So basically a trawler, normally a Frenchman or a Belgie, goes through their gear and they struggle to find their pots. But like I said, exactly the same method, very low impact, zero bycatch other than whelks primarily. Wreck netting. As the name suggests, nets shot over the top of wrecks. One of the more controversial methods at the minute, and indeed of all time actually, to be fair. Wrecks, they're a safe haven for fish. Personally, I think they should be designated as such, a bit like we've got MPAs, MPZs, all that sort of stuff, or MCZs, sorry. Wrecks, they should be a safe haven with an exclusion zone for commercial fishing around them, in my own view. I have a lot of admiration for the skill of the skipper that does this sort of fishing, because they have to shoot the net up tide and they let the net drift down, and the aim is to settle these nets over the top of wrecks where these pollock, cod and bass are laying. Now, it's a very skillful thing to do. The trouble you've got is these nets, they're semi-buoyant, so they stand up quite high above the wreck, unlike the other nets that we've spoken about previously. These nets are designed to stand up a good depth from the bottom. Now, because it's wrecks, these nets more often than not will catch up, snag up, rip, and it's not uncommon for fishermen to lose whole nets on wrecks. And then, of course, because of the type of net they are, they then carry on fishing and become ghost nets. Anybody who watched the recent fishing series on the BBC, I think it was, on iPlayer, these netting boats, these wreck netting boats, they're going out targeting these wrecks. Their aim for the trip was 100 boxes. Now, if their aim for a trip is 100 boxes, obviously they might have bad days, but there'll be some days where they have good days as well. So well over 100 boxes of pollock, and we are noticing that now starting to affect the wrecks. Pollock catches are down significantly to what they were, especially the bigger specimens. So this one is one of the more controversial ones. Highly effective way of catching cod, pollock and bass, but it's not without its bycatches. Leaves a lot of ghost netting, and personal opinion, I think all wrecks should be an MPA or an MCZ anyway. That's wreck netting. Well, that's the end of another Amputee Angler video. Something different today, commercial fishing methods there. I hope you learned something and found it interesting and gained something from it. If you do have any questions, I was a commercial fisherman for a fair while, so do drop them in the comments below. Please do like and subscribe and share the video if you do like it, and I'll catch you all again soon.